Well, what exactly is c-betting? Well, c-betting is a short form for continuation betting. And essentially what that means is if you were the raiser before the flop, you were the aggressor before the flop, when the flop comes out, typically everyone's looking to you to drive the action. And they're going to say, well, listen, are you going to continue with your story that you got a really strong hand? So if you do so, that would be what's called a c-bet, a continuation of the story you told with the pre-flop aggression. So why do people c-bet? Like, why is it a thing? Well, again, we talked a little bit in some of the other videos about range advantage, right? So if you've raised before the flop and no one's re-raised you, you have the strongest range in that perspective. Like, you are the most likely player that could still have pocket aces, for example, right? So it's important to continue that story some of the time, not all the time, as we're going to continue to hammer home. No always, no never. But most of the time, or over half the time, depending on how many players are in the pot, you are going to be the one that's going to be the aggressor in these spots. So you're going to want to continue to continuation bet, whether you have it or not. Because a lot of the time, when you don't have anything, your opponent doesn't have anything either, you're just going to win the pot right there. Other times when you do have it, you're just going to get more value from your continuation bet. So you want to have it analogous to a jab, right? You want to keep a pretty steady, diet of jabs coming at your opponents. Not always, you're going to dodge a little bit too, but a good steady amount of jabs. So there's a lot of considerations that you have to think about when it comes to c-betting outside of the specific, type of player you're up against. You also want to factor in, like, how many players. So let's use that same example again, where you're under the gun and you raise with ace-king, and it goes call, call, the button calls, the small blind calls, the big blind calls. So there's 6 players to the flop. And now the flop comes 10-5 deuce, both blinds check to you, and it's up to you. Well, the question is, should you be c-betting more often or less often in a situation like this? Well, the correct answer is less often. The reason being is, with so many more players in the hand, the odds of somebody actually having a 10 or continuing are much higher. When you only have to get through one opponent, it's far more likely that that opponent has completely missed the flop and is just going to fold the hand. When you've got 5 people left to act, you're basically wasting chips. I see far too often players just feel like, well, they have to continuation bet all the time, and it's a wasted bet, and a bet lost in terms of not like getting away with it is going to cost you in the long run. Like, those add up to a big amount of money at the end of the year. The other consideration, aside from the number of players, is what is the flop, right? What type of board is that? What type of board texture? The one we've been discussing so far is a dry board. It's 10-5 deuce. We call that dry because it's not very draw heavy. There's not a lot of there's not a lot of connected cards. We're not talking about 2 suits or anything like that. Well, what about a flop that comes like Jack 9-7 with 2 hearts? It's a very different situation because there's a lot more hands that an opponent is going to continue with on a board like that. So, for example, that same example, if you raise with ace-king under the gun and the button called and it comes Jack 9-7 with 2 hearts, should you be continuation betting more often or less often? Well, let's think about the type of hands in the range that this button's going to call with. Jack 10 suited, Jack 9, 8-9. They're not folding any of these hands. So the likelihood of your c-bet getting through on a board like that, it decreases significantly. So you should definitely shut down a lot more with ace-king in a situation like that. So you want to factor in, how many opponents do I have, and what does that board texture look like? Obviously, position's another factor that you'll always consider, but all those things, as well as your table image, your read on your opponents. This is not an exact science, in a sense, with c-betting, because there's always different flops, always different situations. The more you practice it, the more you get comfortable with a mixed strategy in these situations, the better you're going to do. Before you can even, decide what is a good c-betting board and not, you have to understand, what are good boards for a c-bet. And good boards for the pre-flop raiser in terms of range advantage are boards that often look like something like a paired board, like, deuce, deuce, 3 as I've used, or a very dry board, maybe something like, 10, deuce, 3, where obviously, a 10 is a playable card for a lot of your opponents, but that's the only one there. The opposite of that, some, bad boards for c-betting, unless, of course, you've really got it, are very wet, draw-heavy boards, okay? In terms of efficiency of getting away with c-bets as bluffs, or to get them through as a way to win the pot, the wetter the board, the less likely that's going to be able to succeed. And what is a wet board? A wet board is 2 to 3 connected cards with maybe a flush draw there, 7, 8, 9, 10, Jack, Queen. All of these are very wet boards. The dry boards look like Queen, Deuce, 7, Jack, Deuce, 3. Those are boards that heavily favor the pre-flop raiser's range, right? Because the pre-flop raiser is the one who's most likely to have aces or kings, okay? So aces or kings, when it comes 8, 9, 10, they go way down in value because an 8, 9, 10 flop heavily hits your opponent's range. So now that's a situation where whether you have aces, whether you hit the board or not, you want to lower your c-bet frequency on those dangerous wet boards. Another consideration when it comes to c-betting is, as we've talked about a little bit, is range advantage, right? So in some situations with good boards like deuce, 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 or deuce, deuce, 3, a hand that's not going to see your opponents hit that flop very often, where they're not going to actually improve their hand that they started with. So if you were the pre-flop raiser, this would be a situation where you have range advantage, and that's a good board to continuation bet with. That's not the only one. Another one could be, for example, let's say you raised under the gun, and everyone folds to the big blind and he calls. Well, you have a big range advantage here because you are supposed to have a much better hand, and the big blind should be a little more loosey-goosey. Now the flop comes ace 9, 3, right? No flush draw. He checks. It's up to you. You should, in this situation, probably up your continuation betting frequency because you have range advantage. You have an ace a lot more often than the big blind does. Why? Because when you raise from under the gun, a big part of that range, as you take a look at it, it's going to have an ace in it. You know, the ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, while the big blind is going to play a lot more speculative hands. So that would be a situation, you know, whether you have it or not, where you would up your frequency of c-bets. You know, a deeper look at that example is sometimes you can now base your decision to c-bet on the actual hand you have and be exploitative. So for example, if you have king, queen, and it comes ace, 9, deuce, you're going to bet a higher percentage of the time because that favors you, that board, right? So you can bluff more often at that board. Whereas maybe, you know, if you do have the ace, queen, ace, king, you realize that your opponent probably doesn't have that strong hand, so maybe you want to check back and slow play, and maybe he'll try to bluff at it at a later street. So the bottom line is when boards like this come up, it favors you if you do have a strong hand where you can check back a little more often, and if you do want to bluff, it's a great situation to do that as well. A lot of the time, you're going to find yourself in situations after the flop where you have a drawing hand, whether it's, 4 to a straight, 4 to a flush. You may even have both. You may have a hand where you have, say, for example, queen, 10 of spades, and the flop comes jack of spades, 9 of spades, 4, giving you a straight flush draw. Those are very powerful hands. Now, that's what I would call a monster draw. And in situations where you have a monster draw, there's really almost no hand you'll be up against where you're in really big trouble. There's some hands, obviously, if your opponent has 3 of a kind, or if they have maybe the higher flush draw with the ace-high flush draw, those are some hands that put you in some, tough spots. But overall, those are situations where you typically want to make the pot bigger, and you want to make it bloated. So you're going to want to bet those a little more often. Now, some other draws, maybe, you might not be able to call a check raise, so you do want a free card. Let's say, for example, the flop is king, queen, 9 with 2 hearts, and you have the 6, 7 of hearts. And there's 4 players in the pot. This is probably not a situation where your continuation bet is going to get through. You've also got a pretty vulnerable flush draw. Someone else may have a better one. So that would be kind of like more of a draw that you want to play more timidly. And maybe you can steal it later in the situation, but the monster draws are the ones that you want to definitely up your frequency with. And then the weaker draws, maybe that you can't really fade a check raise with, you don't want to. Having said that, there are some draws, like really weak draws, like gut shots, that you can use as a bluff. So another example would be, let's say it comes queen, 7, 3. You decided to raise it with 5, 6 of spades. You have an inside straight draw. Your opponent's check to you. Well, you have not a great draw, but you have something, and you can continue with it. If you bet and your opponent check raises, a lot of the time you're going to have to fold. Other times you can still peel, and that's okay. Because it wasn't like you're getting yourself off of this, fantastic draw. It's just a gut shot. My mom always said, don't you be chasing no inside straight draws. Okay, well, she never said that, but you get the gist of it. So when you flop a draw, whether it's a monster draw or a weaker draw, there's a couple ways you can win this pot. Number one is you can actually hit it. You can catch the card you need. But by being more aggressive and being the aggressor, you actually give yourself 2 chances to win. You can bet and get your opponent to fold out potentially a better hand. Or if they do call, you still have that backdoor opportunity to actually hit the card. So generally speaking, in situations like this, you're going to get rewarded for aggression. And I would highly suggest, betting on the come, if you will, whatever you want to phrase it as, is a valuable arsenal you want to have to your game. Again, because you don't want to be so easily read that you're only betting when you have top pair or an overpair or three of a kind and checking all your draws. You have to incorporate some betting on the come as well. And there's an added bonus of giving yourself 2 ways to win the pot. When it comes to c-betting, you don't just want to be on autopilot and just be saying, okay, well, I have this hand, I'm just going to c-bet. You need to also be paying attention because sometimes you're going to pick up on something that should alter your strategy significantly. So one of the more basic ones I would say that I look for is the eyes, okay? So typically when you're up against an opponent and they see the flop and the first thing they do is they glance down at their chips, what does that mean to you? Like, what do you think that means? And if you said that means they're likely more interested and they're thinking about betting next, that's probably correct because they like what they see. So in a situation where I would maybe see a real eye glance tell, and sometimes people fake it and reverse it, but a lot of times you'll be able to tell whether it's genuine. Now, when you see that and the players check to you and they've glanced like that, well, now I'd base what my c-betting frequency on my hand. So if I have a strong hand, and I want them to check raise me, I'm going to bet. However, if I do have a weaker hand or a hand that really doesn't want to get check raised, I'm going to increase my checks. So there's more to just c-betting in terms of just like, okay, I check these flops, I bet these flops. You're factoring in so many variables, and one of those things is body language and physical tells. One of the bigger mistakes I see beginning players make is they'll often throw out a continuation bet without any real plan as to how they're going to proceed on the turn in the river. Now, if you have a chess background at all, you'll know that it's important to think several moves ahead. Same holds true in poker. If you're throwing out a continuation bet and then the person calls and you go, oh no, what do I do now, right? You should be thinking about this before you make your first bet. So when you make this first bet, how are you going to react if your opponent raises you? How are you going to react if they call and the turn card comes an ace, king, or a queen? The card that comes in the turn is always going to change your action because some of those cards are going to be beneficial for your opponent's range. Some of them will be beneficial for you. So super important to think a couple steps ahead. I'm making this continuation bet. Why? What are the reasons for this continuation bet? If you can't come up with a couple good reasons as to why this makes sense, guess what? You probably shouldn't do it. Now, if you do decide, oh, you know what? I think this bet makes sense. It should be backed up with an understanding of how you're going to proceed on the turn in the river. So maybe you raised under the gun, the flop came deuce, deuce, three. You're up against an opponent who called from the small blind. So that's a very strong hand typically. And it's maybe a player who is semi-pro, okay? So now his range is going to be what? Like pocket eights, pocket sevens, pocket jacks, pocket tens, maybe ace queen suited, king queen suited, a lot of these types of hands. So the flop is deuce, deuce, three. He checks. You decide a continuation bet. What are you going to do after that? You already know there's a good chance your opponent's going to continue because he's going to have eights, nines, or tens. Now, maybe you have history with this opponent and you know that because you raise into the gun, if you fire first barrel, double barrel, triple barrel, he may fold those hands. But you have to realize that it's not going to work with one clip. You can't just bet the flop and expect him to fold pocket tens. You're going to have to commit in that situation, if you want to bluff this, to a bet on the flop, a bet on the turn, and often a bet on the river. So sometimes you have an amazing game plan for how you're going to maximize profit on this hand where you flop a set, right? And you're like, woo, baby, the flop comes, jack nine deuce and you've got 3 nines and your opponent's got a pretty strong hand and you're going to get maximum value, okay? Well, that's going to heavily depend on the run out. So what is the run out? The run out is essentially, okay, what combination of cards comes in the turn in the river? Well, some of the cards are going to help you make a full house. Some of them are just going to keep the board blank. But what about when the run out comes a 10 and an 8? So now just one card makes a straight. All of a sudden, your game plan is thrown out the window because the run out was so poor for your specific hand and so beneficial for your opponent's hand. So there's good runouts and bad runouts. You should plan your strategy based around both possibilities when you have strong hands and when you have weak hands. Thinking ahead to the fact that, you don't want to be surprised. I'm like, oh no, that card came. What do I do now? You should have thought of that before the card actually came and the run out happened. While Ace King seems like a very powerful hand, the big slick, it is one of the top hands you can get. It's important to also note that when you have Ace King, after the flop, more often than not, you're still going to have just Ace King. You're not going to flop a pair. You're going to flop a pair, around in roughly like a quarter of the time. The other 3/4 of the time, you're maybe going to flop maybe a gut shot. Sometimes you'll have some flush draws or things like that. But it's important to notice that like whatever 2-card combo that you have, you're less likely to hit the flop. And that's important to understand too when it comes to c-betting as a bluff. When your opponent plays a hand from the big blind and the flop comes, Queen 7-4, they are very unlikely, if they didn't start with a pair, to have flopped a pair. What that means is it should give you the green light more often to go ahead and take those pots, understanding that even if you don't flop a pair, that's okay. They probably didn't either.